Michel Foucault originally planned to write a history of sexuality as we understand it today, the modern concept that emerged in the 19th century. But as he worked, he realized something important. He couldn't understand modern sexuality without first understanding how Western man came to see himself as a subject of desire. This led him to shift his entire project backward in time to ancient Greece and Rome. Foucault's goal is not to write a history of sexual behaviors, that is, what people actually did in bed, or a history of ideas about sex, that is, what philosophers and doctors said about sex. Instead, he wants to write a history of thought, that is, a history of how sexual activity became a problem that people felt they needed to think about, worry about, and regulate. This requires three analytical tools. First, archaeology. Archaeology examines how certain topics become objects of knowledge. Second, genealogy. Genealogy traces how these problematizations emerge from actual practices. Third, games of truth, which analyzes how being is constituted as something that can and must be thought. For Foucault, philosophy is not about telling others what to think. It is about testing oneself, changing oneself through the practice of knowledge. It is an ascesis, an exercise of oneself in thought. Foucault identifies four areas where ancient Greek thought expressed concern about sexual behavior. First, the relation to the body that dealt with questions of health, life, and death. The relation to one's wife that includes marriage and family institutions. Third, the relation to boys, that is, the problem of male love relationships. Fourth, the relation to truth, how sexual conduct connects to wisdom. What is important is that these themes of austerity did not line up with simple prohibitions. Greeks were not telling people what was forbidden, rather, they were developing a stylization of conduct. The ethics was addressed to men, not women. Even though women faced stricter constraints, it spoke to men about areas where they had freedom, where they exercised rights, power, and authority. This is crucial. Greek sexual ethics is not about obeying rules but about stylizing freedom. When we study morality, we need to differentiate three things. First, there is the moral code, the system of rules and values that a society recommends through families, schools, churches, and other institutions. This code may be coherent and explicit, or it may be diffuse and contradictory. Second, there is the morality of behaviors, how actual individuals comply with or resist these rules. Do they obey? Do they transgress? Or do they find loopholes? Third, there is a formation of ethical subjects, how individuals constitute themselves as moral agents. This is what Foucault calls subjectivation. Subjectivation involves four dimensions. First, ethical substance. What part of the self becomes the focus of moral work? For the Greeks, this was the aphrodisia, the acts, desires, and pleasures as a dynamic whole. Second is the mode of subjection, how the individual relates to the rule. For Greeks, not as obedience to law, but as an art or savoir faire. Third, ethical work, the transformations one performs on oneself. For the Greeks, through struggle, combat, and training. Fourth is telos, the mode of being one aims for. For the Greeks, active freedom and an aesthetics of existence. This third level is what Foucault is interested. He wants to write a history of ethics and ascetics, the practices through which people form themselves as moral subjects. The Greeks did not have a concept of sexuality. They used the term aphrodisia, the works of Aphrodite, to refer to sexual acts, gestures, and contacts that produced pleasure. Unlike Christian flesh or modern sexuality, the aphrodisia were not something to be suspicious of. There was no classification of permissible and forbidden acts, no detailed manuals of what to do or avoid. Instead, the Greeks understood sexual activity as a dynamics, a force that linked act, pleasure, and desire together in a circle. Desire leads to the act produces pleasure, pleasure stimulates desire. The moral question was not which acts, but with what force is one transported by pleasures and desires. This dynamics was analyzed through two variables. One, quantity, moderation versus excess. The problem was not the type of object, women or boys, but the intensity and frequency of activity. Excess was the primary moral fault. Second is position, active versus passive roles. For a man, the active penetrating role was honorable. The passive role was associated with women, slaves, and boys and could bring shame to a free man. So, for Greeks, sexual immorality had two main forms: excess, doing it too much, and passivity, accepting the subordinate role. Rather than a code of permitted and forbidden acts, Greek ethics was about the use of pleasures, how to manage them wisely. This involved three strategies. First, need. Let desire be guided by natural need. Eat when hungry, drink when thirsty, have sex when the body truly requires it. This prevents excess and avoids artificial desires. Socrates famously said, "Appetite is the best sauce. Wait until you are truly hungry to eat." Second, timeliness, kairos. Know the right time. This includes the right season of the year, the right time of life, the right time of day, and the right circumstances. The same act might be good or bad depending on when it occurs. Third, status. Adapt your conduct to who you are. Those with higher status, more public responsibility, and greater authority are expected to show greater restraint. Moderation is not for everyone equally. It is especially required of leaders. Mastery is not about eliminating desire, but about controlling it. The Greeks understood the relationship with oneself as a struggle, a combat against desires that are like internal enemies. This combat has several features. It is agonistic. You must fight against desires that might overpower you. It is a relationship with oneself. You are both the fighter and the enemy. It requires training, ascesis. You must exercise and prepare yourself. But this training was not yet a separate spiritual practice. It was the same training that made someone a good citizen. Learning to govern oneself was continuous with learning to govern others. The goal of this self mastery was freedom, freedom from being enslaved to one's desires. For the Greeks, the opposite of freedom was not external coercion but self enslavement. A man who cannot control his desires is like a slave to the worst possible masters. This freedom was also a power. The man who masters himself is qualified to master others. Moderation was seen as a virile virtue, something that characterized a true man. Women could be moderate too, but their moderation was always referred back to male authority. Even when a woman was moderate, it was a kind of masculine quality in her. Crucially, this self mastery required a relation to truth. The moderate man must be guided by reason, logos, But this was not about deciphering hidden desires within himself. It was not a hermeneutics of the self. Instead, it was about structure. That is, reason must rule over desire. The proper hierarchy of the soul, prudence, using practical reason to determine the right course, and ontology, recognizing the true nature of the soul and its relation to being. This relation to truth opened an aesthetics of existence. The moderate life had a beautiful, orderly shape. It was like a work of art that was visible to others and worthy of memory. Greek ethics of pleasure was about stylization, not codification. It was about stylizing attitudes, developing a certain way of being in relation to oneself, creating an aesthetics of existence, that is, making one's life a beautiful work, and exercising freedom, using one's liberty to fashion oneself as a subject. This is fundamentally different from what came later. Christian ethics would be about codifying acts, what is permitted and forbidden, and hermeneutics of desire, deciphering hidden desires in the soul. The Greek approach was concerned with the activity itself, its intensity, its timing, its style. Foucault's great insight is that if we want to understand how we became subjects of desire, we need to see how this ancient aesthetics of existence was gradually transformed into a morality of renunciation and self decipherment. The Greeks were not simply tolerant or free, they had their own forms of austerity and concern. But their concern was about how to use pleasure well, not how to root out desire itself. This is the framework that will guide Foucault's analysis of the three great domains of practice: dietetics, relation to the body; economics, relation to marriage; and erotics, relation to boys. In each domain, we will see how the Greeks developed stylized practices of self mastery that were very different from the later Christian morality of the flesh.